Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studio, you are listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm your host, Dustin Friesenheim.
And I'm your host, Mike Josic, and I would just like to draw attention to Dustin's audio this month.
I have no idea what's happening because I didn't change a thing.
This is different. This is new. We've changed nothing, but we're getting weird audio from Dustin. So sorry for calling out like this, Dustin, but the audio file in me has to address the technical issue before we move on.
As long as I'm getting all the blame.
If you are a regular listener, welcome back to the show. If this is your first time checking out the podcast, we just want to give you a warning that when we discuss the movies, we discuss them in their entirety. So moving forward, spoilers ahead. So as you all probably know, the film that we are covering this time, and the word film is used a little loosely here.
Short film is still a film. It's there in the title.
Technically, I think 40 or 60 minutes. It depends on who you're asking. That's the cutoff for feature film. This would definitely fit in the short film category, running at a roughly 30 minutes. But as we've pointed out on several occasions, the Sight and Sound list contains some really, really short form films.
I think the shortest I've seen is a minute.
And I think some of those are on there just because, for historical purposes, it's possibly some of the first film ever shot, or the first film ever shot on a particular subject, or just electrocuting an elephant.
That's the one I was actually referring to.
Thankfully, no elephants were harmed in the making of this film.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. And that film would be Aardman Animation's 1993 Oscar-winning stop-motion short film, Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers.
AKA Wallace and Gromit, the worst birthday present.
Now, when you suggested this film, I thought this was something that I had seen before, but I think I've only just seen clips of it. In fact, I don't know if I've ever actually sat down through an entire Wallace and Gromit film or short film, although I've seen other Aardman productions. It's kind of like The Simpsons, where The Simpsons, you have this pop culture knowledge that you've absorbed through jokes that were made on The Simpsons. You know your Citizen Kane, your Planet of the Apes, your North by Northwest, but you've never actually seen those films. So this was kind of an interesting experience for me. My understanding, Dustin, you've seen this picture before?
I'm pretty sure I have. I don't know how many of the Wallace and Gromit shorts or films I've seen throughout my life, but it was definitely almost 30 years ago. So I probably saw them when they were new and then promptly forgot because I wasn't even 10 yet.
It was a great pick because I was kind of experiencing a little burnout after October's marathon Halloween stuff. To be fair, I'm finally acknowledging that I'm always feeling a little burnout after October's marathon Halloween stuff. And you decided to choose a short subject, also a comedy subject, an animated subject. So this was kind of like a palate cleanser.
You're welcome, sir.
Yeah, and so I was really pleased, and I was surprised because I didn't think I was going to react to it quite the way that I did, but we'll save that for the discussion moving forward, and I'll throw the credits out right now so that we can get to that discussion. Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers was directed by Nick Park, written by Nick Park, Bob Baker, and Brian Sibley. It was produced by Christopher Mole, starred Peter Sallis. Cinematography was by Tristan Oliver and Dave Alex Ridditt, edited by Helen Garand, music by Julian Knott, produced by Aardman Animations, and distributed by BBC Enterprises, being released on the 26th of December 1993 in the UK and the 17th of December 1993 in the US. I'd actually be curious to know if that has something to do with getting it under the wire for Oscar consideration, because it seems weird that it debuted in the US before the UK, but that's neither here nor there, and I don't have that information. The film is widely regarded as a masterful stop-motion film. It is much beloved. It has an approval rating of 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. It has won the aforementioned Oscar at the 1993 Academy Awards, as well as a number of other awards at animation festivals in the early 90s.
And despite all of that, it only makes it to the critics' poll at 894, like so many others.
The way we usually roll is Dustin does a quick summary of the film and then throws out his first impressions, and then I jump in and the conversation kind of goes from there. So, Dustin, if you would be so kind as to throw out your summary of The Wrong Trousers.
Wallace and Gromit's The Wrong Trousers is about Gromit's birthday, wherein he gets a gift from Wallace, which happens to be a pair of mechanical trousers. Now, the reason I called it the worst birthday present is because he got it so that the trousers could take Gromit out for a walk whenever he wants without Wallace having to be there, which really kind of seems like, hey, now I have to see you less. Awesome, that sounds great. And on top of that, Gromit's smart enough that he doesn't need these whatsoever. He can just go, he's reading the paper, he's knitting, he's doing all sorts of stuff. And none of that ever really seems to be acknowledged by Wallace, who just treats him like a doorstop, really. Actually, when he gives him the gift, he says, now it looks like you're owned, because he also gives him a collar to go with it.
That's such a great line.
Now you look like you're owned by someone. It's like, wow, buddy. And the look that Gromit gives him, it says everything. But because of the amount of money he spent on this gift, he now needs to take on a boarder at their house. This boarder comes in, takes over Gromit's room, and as it turns out, happens to be a penguin who moonlights as a chicken that robs assorted things,
The notorious Feathers McGraw.
despite a complete lack of feathers. Do penguins have feathers?
I believe they do.
Well, I know they have feathers when they're born and they're young, that's for sure.
Because they do
Either
molt.
way,
I don't know.
either way, this penguin decides to use these trousers in order to frame Wallace for robbing a diamond nearby, and then hijinks ensue until eventually he is recaptured and thrown into prison, aka the zoo. Fade to black, end credits, end of film.
A wonderful train chase.
I believe that falls under hijinks.
So how was it ostensibly revisiting this film, since you don't 100% clearly remember having watched it?
I remember absolutely nothing of any of these except for what you might see from just a still. I definitely remember the animation and the style and the voices, but I remember nothing else. So going back to it, it's almost a fresh take. And I was actually skimming through it a little bit early on to see how much I remembered, and I stopped at just the wrong part. I stopped when he's there just like drinking some tea and Gromit's knitting something, and I'm like, wow, this is kind of dull right here. I mean, the animation is great, but there's not really much going on. But watching it in its entirety, it definitely ended up a whole heck of a lot better.
So you're saying you stopped at the wrong parts of The Wrong Trousers?
That is correct. The wrong trouser parts. What would the wrong trouser part be? Bad stitches, I guess?
I think that's a different podcast.
In terms of the film as a whole, you have to give so much credit to just the fantastic animation. Really, just it is at this even now just astounding. Quite frankly, I recently saw Mad God, which took what I think like 15 years to finally create, some ridiculous number like that, and there you're seeing some more of the general staples of stop motion animation, but here it is seamless. I'm not even too sure how they do half the stuff they do with so little visual flaws.
I was honestly really surprised. Coming into it, my experience with Wallace and Gromit was being accustomed to a much cleaner animation, not style, but the models themselves being kind of less lumpy and a little bit more refined. And when I first started watching this, I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of going back. I didn't realize it was still in this kind of more rougher stage. But I forgot about that so quickly because the animation is just so deftly done. The expressions, the movements, everything's so fluid. And then the story is just entertaining and delightful. And it really surprised me. I expected more, thought I got less, and then ended up being pleasantly surprised in the end. So it was like this very brief but wild little roller coaster as a viewer.
The amount of expression you can get out of Gromit, like I was saying earlier on, is phenomenal. I mean, Wallace is just a complete and utter tool. And I think you were saying that you checked out something else and saw that that's sort of characteristic of him. I honestly didn't recall anything of Wallace's behavior from when I was a kid, but he is a turd. He is a turd sandwich.
I did remember that Wallace was supposed to be kind of clueless. I mean, he's an inventor. I believe the first Wallace and Gromit film, he's an inventor who builds himself a rocket, but he builds it in his basement. Which just tells you what kind of inventor Wallace is. And Gromit, being way smarter than Wallace can ever really know, who's the real brains of the operation and who has to fix everything, that any calamity that Wallace kind of sets into motion. You really nailed it kind of when you said that Gromit communicates so much just through facial expressions. And it's something that I've heard referred to in discussions of Aardman Animations. Like, Gromit has never said a word, and he's one of the most emotive and beloved kind of animated characters. He communicates so much with very, very little. And to have to do that by hand, I mean, you draw by hand as well, but to manipulate this plasticine in such a way that it's communicating those things, I feel is kind of a bigger challenge, and they meet that challenge and absolutely crush that challenge. Even the rougher Wallace, who's, a little lumpy and a little less defined, like I said, compared to his later iterations, his fingers are kind of chunky and his face is a little lumpy, but just the cadences of the voice that Peter Sallis contributes, and the dryness of the humor, and the timing of it all, the comic timing of it all.
I'm not sure if he understands anything at any point. That's just sort of the look that he has at all times, Wallace.
And it's also, I think, punctuated by the music. Especially when you have a character who's not saying a lot. Although I think you'd probably be picking
characters who aren't saying a lot, because Feathers doesn't say a word either.
That's also correct. And he's even less expressive than Gromit is, which is kind of amazing. But like that first turnaround when he first comes in the house and there's that musical sting and he turns and he just kind of stares at him. He's just got that like blank stare, and like, you just know in that moment shit's going to get real.
Right there.
This is the bad guy. We have entered Hitchcock territory. And I have to say, this is, I did not expect I'd be saying this, but this is quickly crawled into the number 2 spot for me as far as Hitchcock movies go. The first, of course, being To Catch a Thief.
Which I don't think I've ever seen.
I think it might be on the list, too. So I'm kind of...
But will it be on the list as of next week?
That's a good point. It's a very good point. I know there's multiple Hitchcock movies on there. Like, I know Psycho's on there. I'm pretty sure North by Northwest is on there. I'd be surprised if To Catch a Thief isn't on there, but I've been surprised that a lot of movies aren't on there.
And surprised by some movies that are on there. Hitman.
Now, the whole plot with Feathers McGraw centers around him basically getting a base of operations in order to steal the Blue Diamond. Also, he has a plan to utilize the trousers, and some of the brilliance of that for me, it starts in a very kind of domestic situation. I thought it was just going to be hijinks with the trousers, and it was going to be Wallace and Gromit just doing domestic things and calamity happening and pratfalls and sight gags. And then this sinister penguin comes into it, and it turns into a heist movie, turns into this crazy thriller. And it was kind of in that moment that I think I locked in. As soon as I realized, like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. Because I was also wondering, like, how is this going to run 30 minutes?
You could say the same of almost any Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote sort of shorts, where it's just some vignettes of here's some goofiness going on.
Yeah, but those are 7 minutes long, including credits. So...
I thought they had a whole TV show. Granted, I've never seen it, so it might have other stuff going on.
Well, I mean, they did, but that was just old cartoons kind of stitched together. I don't think the Roadrunner gags would sustain for 30 minutes unless you were literally sitting down and watching like old Roadrunner cartoons for 30 minutes and being like, I'm going to watch the next one. I'm going to watch the next one. But the narrative just doesn't, the whole aesthetic and the concept of the show doesn't stand up to long form narrative, which is why you don't see a lot of really successful Warner Brothers Looney Tunes movies.
Except for Space Jam, I guess.
I've never seen Space Jam, so I can't really comment. But the reason I've never
seen it in like 20 years.
The reason I've never seen Space Jam is because it seemed like it was more of a Michael Jordan commercial, and they just kind of threw, Bill Murray and the Looney Tunes characters in there. I've seen the Back in Action film, and that seemed to struggle a lot to kind of maintain. They kind of rely really heavily on the human actors to bring interest and narrative, and the Looney Tunes characters are in there for comic relief.
Whereas in this film, the human characters, he's he's just there pretty much to create a situation that Gromit now has to deal with. And poor Gromit, he's just the straight man, just reacting to everything. He carries the film, as far as I'm concerned.
He has so many great moments. The moment where he's following Feathers McGraw and he gets into that box and he cuts out the eyes and Feathers McGraw's coming over. Like there's genuine tension and threat there. And then you see it from outside and it's like a box for dog food or something. And there's a dog and he cut out the eyes on the dog and it's his eyes in there. And ridiculous payoff, but it works. And hiding under the covers when Feathers McGraw is leaving the house and he
Puts on that rubber glove, at which point suddenly he realizes, that's that penguin that I saw on the wanted poster.
and the cluelessness of Wallace, the amazing moment where he finally realizes that his boarder is the villain of the film, and he's like, "It's you." I kind of like that conceit. Actually, Gromit had that as well. There was the moment with the sign that he saw on the post.
But there he wasn't too sure. He was curious, and you could tell. It wasn't until he saw the glove that it all came together. I mean, to him, probably all penguins look the same. You know how racist dogs are. But speaking of moments, when Gromit heads outside and it's raining, and he's packing up his little bindle and getting the heck out of Dodge, and he sees Feathers hiding out in the window of his old room, and it's raining. Just the ability of getting the rain to hit in a stop motion as perfectly as they did there was just insane to me.
I'm always stunned when stop motion artists decide to incorporate water because there are techniques for it. And I know that glycerin is used heavily, just like when you're seeing condensation on a beer mug or a pop can in an advertisement, that's glycerin. That's not actual H2O condensation. They use glycerin to stand in for water in the stop motion as well. And they can manipulate it, on his raincoat and whatnot. But then to show the falling rain, I'm not 100% sure, but I think they run it down really like thin filament to give it the impression that it's falling. And then they just like speed it up so it's coming down at the speed that rain would come down. But it's stop motion animation in and of itself is so laborious and so tedious. And to incorporate something that makes it even more laborious and more tedious just stuns me. And it's one of the reasons why I think I love stop motion animation so much. Anytime I watch any stop motion film, I recently watched Paranorman again, and I cannot watch these types of movies without, half of me is just enjoying them as a viewer, and then half of me is literally marveling at the technique and the skill and the art of the whole thing. Because it's kind of like when someone cooks you an amazing meal. It tastes great and you're loving it, but then to also have them go the extra mile and just do like some really wonderful presentation, you kind of appreciating it on more than one level. And that's how I always feel with stop motion. And when that rain scene hit, that was a very similar feeling that I got.
Well, I've never cared about presentation of food, but I can definitely get behind the presentation of stop motion. I did one 1 minute stop motion thing back in high school that was garbage. So I know exactly how hard and annoying it is to do this stuff. Even at just such a small scale. And I will absolutely forgive quality of animation like Pingu because I know that, hey, even that's phenomenal.
I was watching this Aardman documentary not too long after watching this short film. And it was funny how one of the guys who's like a production supervisor or something, he kind of runs the shop or something. I don't remember his name, but he was sort of describing what the process of stop motion animation is. And he was like, so the character lifts his hand like this, and then you move your finger like this, and you take a picture. And like after every movement, it was take a picture. And they would cut away from him after a couple of lines, and they'd go and they'd like do interviews with other people. Then they'd come back to him, and he'd be like, and then you take this finger and you move it like this, and then you take a picture. And then they'd cut away from him, and they'd go to somebody else. They just kept coming back to him, and I was like, it was funny, but I also thought, in a weird way, it was really representative of sort of the process of stop motion where it just takes a long time. And as much as I was kind of amazed by the use of the glycerin or the water, I'm still stumped by the lasers. We talked briefly about the lasers between you and myself, and I was like, well, maybe it's like fiber optic or maybe it's something else. And you're like, well, maybe it's just actually a laser. And I went back and I checked it out, and I can't figure it out. It's the one thing in the movie that it's a total mystery to me.
It's like the baby in David Lynch's Eraserhead. No one will ever know the secret.
Oh, that's right. If that was like constructed or if it was made of like butcher shop pieces of things, because it looks
Kissing
kind
the
of like a
Lamb
dead
is the
rabbit or
one
something.
thing. Yeah, that's I remember hearing that one predominantly. Although I think Aardman might actually be a bit more willing to talk about it.
Probably, probably. And there's also the possibility, I mean, this is 1993. They could just be computer generated lasers. It's a
We have
pretty
the technology.
it's a pretty basic thing. And even though computer generated effects were kind of in their infancy, it's so basic that it definitely could have been used. But it could also just been a laser pointer with some smoke in the room, or maybe it was fiber optics. But there's also, I think there was some lighting effect in it, like the light was moving. I don't know. I'll have to go back, or maybe I'll do some research because I'm like super curious now.
Sometimes that happens.
I
Let
did
us
want to
know. So save Mike some research, guys, if anybody out here happens to know.
I did want to go back to the music briefly. I mentioned the music being kind of instrumental in the mood. And, it starts very just kind of happy and domestic and comedic, and then goes full like Bernard Herrmann to embrace the sleuthy Hitchcockian kind of vibe of it. But as I was saying earlier, I think that even though the animation is good enough that you could theoretically just have these characters moving around doing their thing, I think the music does an incredible job of just enhancing the mood. Like even when I was saying that moment where the penguin Feathers McGraw was suspicious that he was being spied on and was walking kind of towards the box that Gromit was hiding in and sort of giving it a little more scrutiny than he was before, and Gromit was worried that he was going to get found out. The music there, it does such a good job of setting the mood and the tension, and even though it's a comedy and it's not going to go anywhere like truly dark, it's just so successful. And then also using, like, there's that song that he plays in his room, and that song actually changes depending on which version you're watching. One of the interesting aspects of the film is the soundtrack alterations. And I watched my version on YouTube. I'm not sure, where did you see yours?
YouTube or Vimeo, I forget where.
So, according to Wikipedia, in the original airing, the first VHS release of the film and the DVD release in '99, Gromit's birthday card plays Happy Birthday to You. And in subsequent releases, it was replaced with For He's a Jolly Good Fellow to avoid copyright infringements. And then it was altered again for copyright reasons when Feathers McGraw is playing the radio up in his room. There's two songs that are replaced with unidentified pieces of music. Though Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree was left intact because it's in the public domain. And the two pieces removed were Happy Talk from the musical South Pacific and How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? So, like so many things that have been transported to home video and physical media and streaming and whatnot, because people were not expecting things to go that direction. So they didn't secure any kind of rights for that. And there wasn't any kind of system for securing rights like that necessarily. When you want to release something, you either have to go back and like retroactively pay for that shit, or you have to just replace the music. And there's numerous television shows and films and stuff where just the pain in the ass that presents is just not worth it for, getting the material out there. So I don't remember what it was in the version that I saw. It may have been the original.
I definitely saw the original. It was Happy Talk for sure.
Okay. I'll have to go back to the video that I saw just to kind of confirm for myself. But seeing as how it was on YouTube, there's a very good chance that it was like copied and ported from the original DVD release. But just for any listeners out there who are curious and musically minded, there are soundtrack alterations. And if you're a purist or a collector or whatever, that's definitely something to look out for.
I'm always a little confused at how that stuff happens. I mean, I was watching a video where they had the same thing in video games where people's likenesses, they didn't have the rights to it anymore, so they had to get rid of it. Mike Tyson's Punch Out, for example. I mean, you'd think that you'd be able to keep Mike Tyson. He's in the name of the game, but nope. Changed to Mr. Dream and all that other stuff.
I know a comic book artist who was working on a graphic novel for the X-Files franchise back in the, oh Jesus, would have been the 90s, I believe, for Topps Comics. And they kept butting heads with the Fox licensing department because they kept sending stuff back and saying like, no, you got to change it. You got to change it. The likenesses, you got to change it. And she was so frustrated because she's like, I'm trying to get this as close to the character's likenesses as I can. And she even took it to like another artist who's famous for almost photorealistic painting. And he's like, no, this, I couldn't do better. Like, this is totally them. And she got into this huge fight with Fox. And they finally said, yes, that's the problem. They look too much like David and Gillian, and we don't have the right to do David and Gillian's likeness. We need you to make them look like Scully and Mulder. And at that point, her head exploded, and I don't know if she's done licensed comics since.
I think at that point you're justified in just burning down the whole building.
Yeah, yeah, but it
Not
makes
a,
sense.
not a
Like,
jury in the land would convict.
if you can make the characters look just enough so that you can identify them as Mulder and Scully, but not look just like David and Gillian, I don't know. It seems like a super tricky line to walk. But anyways, that's getting into kind of the weeds of copyright and home video releases and whatnot, the ephemera of altered bits. But I'm curious. I brought up the music because I wanted to know if, again, I'm always curious to know how you reacted to the music because you're so mercurial when it comes to how music works on you in film. And for me, I thought it was just such a signature piece. So I wanted just kind of your 2 cents.
What I would say about it, hearing you talk about it, usually when you're talking about a kids show stuff, it's a bit more jarring. It's a little bit more ham-fisted in the music score and the stings and all that. But here it didn't stand out in that way. So it was a lot more subtle. It did its job, but didn't sort of look down on you as a listener in terms of trying to tell you how to feel with the music, which is a tricky line to walk when you've got characters who don't speak, so you are relying on music and music stings in order to tell you sort of what you should be thinking.
There's such well, not temptation, but there's almost a standard operating procedure in animation geared towards a younger audience to kind of Mickey Mouse the whole thing. And it is super interesting when somebody sort of takes the music really seriously and maybe composes something counterintuitive to go, against picture, or is just setting a mood and not necessarily Mickey Mousing it. Mickey Mousing, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, is when, if a character is walking and the music is like plunk, 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 with every step. It's basically the music just following the picture sort of like to a T.
Yeah, that gets to be a bit too much. It's definitely very in your face.
And a lot of music and dialogue is used to keep kids' attention because they're afraid that someone's going to like just zone out and turn off the TV. And so it's just there to like keep the stimulation going. I'm always amazed when I watch an animated show where they just value silence.
Samurai Jack, anybody?
But I really dug this. I really thought Julian Knott like hit it out of the park. I'm not surprised this won an Oscar. It's just really well done. It's got a lot of heart. It's a good story. The train, we never talked about the train chase. That train chase is insane.
The speed at which Gromit's moving his hands, like that's some crazy work right there.
Like we talked about the tediousness and the laboriousness of stop motion animation, and then creating a scenario where your character has to lay down track as the train is running on the track. Like it's just adding insult to injury for the animators. But
I actually wonder if that might be a bit easier since technically what you'd probably want to do is just move it more than you normally would. The real trick there is making it not look clunky. And I think having his head moving in a normal pace that you'd expect might actually help with that.
That's just it. The faster movements are just more exaggerated movements because you don't need to have as many frames per second in the movement. But I think
And if
because
you had like
it's
legit rails, you could say, okay, they're moving 1/4 of the rail every time, which means you have those 4 frames to go and drop one of the new rails. So you'd actually have a mathematical system to really help you between shots. I think it wouldn't be as terrible as you might think.
but they have the actual pieces of track that he's laying down, and there has to be, because the train is moving forward, the track has to keep extending. It's not just that his paw is moving like back and forth holding a piece of track. He has to actually leave a piece of track behind. So it's a lot of pieces. It's a lot of pieces, and I don't think they had a lot of room either. I'm trying to remember what I saw about it in the documentary, and I think they just kept moving it like the same 4 feet or something. Like it wasn't a huge length of space that they had to kind of shoot that. Obviously, they're just blurring the backgrounds. There's a lot of tricks that you can do to kind of like show speed, but
You'd absolutely have to because at the speed that they were going and the amount of time that the train chase was, I mean, tracks would be layered over each other about 47 times.
it was
That you
exciting.
definitely don't see.
It was exciting. It was brilliant. It was a wonderful little conclusion. Having feathers like plop into the bottle. For some reason, I just kind of love that little punctuation, and then taking him to jail or to the zoo rather than
Yeah, I like how
jail.
it started out as sort of a jail and then it zooms out to welcome to the zoo, at which point it's almost a little bit of a commentary on how we treat animals in the zoo.
So I don't have much more to say about this movie other than just kind of continually gushing about how fun and delightful it was. Do you have anything that you want to add?
Honestly, I think most of it was said with the amount of personality that they managed to cram into some of these characters in just half an hour. Even Wallace, who I gave some crap to, seeing his Rube Goldberg devices to get him in and out of bed and whatnot, and talking about having to tinker with it a little bit, it tells you a lot about him, what he does with his day, and how not everything is just some perfect thing the first time around. Just saying like, I fell a little too fast. He's trying to readjust himself because gave himself a little wedgie. Like it's small little details which can add so much, and in half an hour, you're more connected to these people than you are some characters in 2 hour films.
I'm sure we've probably missed some detail that somebody loves about this film. If that's the case, be sure to hit us up in the comments and let us know. But I think with that, we will move on to the adjudication phase of the show.
It's my turn for breakfast this morning, Gromit. I like a 3-minute egg. Whoa, steady on. Wow! Gromit! Oh! Oh! Well, that went as well as could be expected, didn't it?
Dustin, Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers. Is it a masterpiece or is it a museum piece?
I think in terms of short children's film, this is a film that will last. It is one that is of great quality for pretty much every single area, and it's something that'll be fun for kids to watch and children of all ages even. I don't know how popular it is amongst adults, but it's not something where you go back to it and see it as a 37-year-old, for example, and think, man, this was garbage. My childhood, I had no taste. No, I actually thought it was a good film to be watching again. So that is something that will stand the test of time. That is a children's film masterpiece.
I'm going to contest your assertion that this is a children's film. While I do think that kids are drawn to animation and that this is a fairly harmless film, that's not going to scar any kids, I don't think it was made for children. I mean, Aardman stuff always has a sense of fun and playfulness to it. But in the same way that, like, say, Philip Pullman wrote the Northern Lights trilogy, and people were like, oh, okay, so this is like a young adult series. And he's like, no, it just happens to star a character who is young. And they're like, yeah, so it's a young adult series. He's like, no. But then it gets marketed as a young adult series because Harry Potter is big and there's all sorts of, things going on in the young adult market. I think this, like anything else, the Looney Tunes cartoons, the aforementioned cartoons that we were talking about with the Roadrunner and whatnot, those weren't made for kids either. Those were made by adults for adults. They showed in the theater and kids just also happened to love them. And then cartoons in general, animation in general, just ended up getting this stigma as being for kids. It used to be loved by adults, but then I don't know, culturally, or I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden it was kids fair. I think honestly it might have been the whole Hanna-Barbera thing on TV, which is a whole nother discussion and weirdly ties into my Scooby-Doo podcast, which I don't even know if our listeners know that I have a Scooby-Doo podcast aside from this one. But I defy your masterpiece for a children's movie. I am going to vote this as a masterpiece because it was so delightful and so well put together. I think we've often talked about films that are on the list that might be, technically brilliant, but just have like a shit story. I mentioned at the top of the show that I was a little underwhelmed with the animation at first because of how unrefined it sort of seemed, but then
I
realized,
still don't know what you're talking about calling it unrefined, so I
well,
have to disagree with you there on that one.
if you look at The Wrong Trousers and then you look at, A Matter of Loaf and Death, for example, or The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, the characters just look a lot more smoother and more refined, whereas in The Wrong Trousers, they're a little lumpy. And it just wasn't how I expected to see them because I'm used to seeing them in that other way. So I was like, this is a little bit more, not quite proto Wallace and Gromit because that goes back even further, but this was definitely on that developmental, evolutionary road to where they sort of got. And for a moment, for a brief moment, I thought, I'm probably not going to vote this masterpiece, partly because it was sort of rougher and earlier, but then it just didn't matter. And it was so funny and so well done. It's technically brilliant and the story is brilliant and it's just the aesthetic. And after 2 minutes, I just didn't care. But I love this. I love this movie. I think it's definitely a masterpiece. Rather than classifying it as a children's masterpiece, I would, if anything, classify it as a short subject masterpiece, since it is a 30-minute film. But yeah, that's where I stand on it, man.
I wouldn't, I'm not too sure as just a short film in and of itself. I'd consider it a masterpiece. I don't think there's enough quite going on for it to stand on its own as something that's more than something to just amuse and entertain. I'm not sure that I would be able to, but I see things such as this where, yeah, it could just be that it's made for adults, but in a way that children can enjoy without trauma or anything like that. I see it more as something that's made for children that's done with enough quality that adults enjoy it as well. And while I do agree and know that Looney Tunes and whatnot were made for adults way back when, this was made in '93 after that shift has already happened. I mean, this happened after the '80s, and we've seen cartoons at that point where it was basically just ways to sell toys to kids. And certainly, as somebody who's grown up watching a lot of anime, I know that it can definitely be for adults. And I'm usually pretty clear about that distinction, but it's not the feeling I get on this one. Put it that way.
Well, we can agree to disagree on the classification of the film, but we definitely both agree that Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers, falls into the masterpiece category as far as the Sight and Sound list is concerned, and the commentators on For Your Consideration are concerned.
It's a masterpiece.
We'd love to hear what you think about our commentary on the film or the film itself. You can hit us up on our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Leave a comment while you're there. Like, follow, share, subscribe, do all the things that you do with the social medias. Word of mouth is also a powerful tool, so we'd love it. A retweet or a share or something like that, just to help spread the word of the show and get it into the eyes and ears of folks who may be interested in the content, but don't know that we're out there because, there's like 2 billion podcasts about films where 2 roommates talk about the movies that they watched.
There's at least 4 or 5 different For Your Consideration films looking at classic films, one of which even had a mic.
Honestly, I think those other ones have officially pod faded. We have outlived them, and we are most likely the premier For Your Consideration podcast. So, and from what I hear, despite the fact that we're just like 2 white dudes who used to be roommates talking about movies, and it's the most cliched podcast concept on the planet, people do seem to enjoy our takes and our perspectives. So it's because of that we keep going. So thanks everybody for your support, for downloading us, for letting us get into your ear holes like that.
Especially as we move into this fantastical new era, starting either next month or the month after, depending on whether or not Mike's pick makes it into the new list, because the greatest films of all time 2022 is coming out in a certain amount of time based off when this recording happens and when it gets posted.
The episode should be dropping before the end of the month. It should still exist within November, but I believe you said that the list is officially coming out at the end of November. So it's going to be a lot of films are going to carry over, but some films are going to drop away and some films are going to be added. So we're really curious to see where this goes. And
10 whole years worth of films that we've been looking at, that we've been seeing and wondering if they're going to make the list. Not to mention all the films that we've seen that we thought should have made the list the first time. Will they make it there? Is Martyrs finally going to get its rightful spot?
And as excited as I am for the new list to come out and for those new options and alternatives to be available to us, I decided, since we're still in November, we're recording in November, I'm going to pick in November. And I also think that the movie that I'm going to pick is a movie that very likely will not make the new list. So it kind of feels like a last gasp, celebrating the end of the old and the coming of the new, and also kind of addressing the preposterousness of some of the films that made it onto the list when so many amazing films did not. So for our next episode in December, which will be closing out our podcasting year, is going to be Pirates of the Caribbean 3 at World's End.
And Mike chose number 3, not because 1 and 2 aren't necessarily better, just that they're not on the list for whatever reason.
And that's part of the reason why I want to do it, because someone picked 3. Like of the 3, I mean, there's 5 movies technically, but out of that original trilogy by Gore Verbinski, they chose 3. Like Curse of the Black Pearl is a wonderfully entertaining movie, and it kicked off an entire franchise and a sensation. Why isn't that on there? Why 3?
But I mean, that's going past the fact that out of all the films ever made up until 2012, he chose Pirates of the Caribbean as one of the top 10 of all time.
Exactly. It's such a curious thing that I just need to live in that for a minute and examine that. So that'll be our next film on the show. Be sure to check us out then. And without further ado, we will close things off for this episode. Dustin, thank you so much for picking this movie and joining me on another movie conversation.
And thanks for having me and doing all of the hard work, good sir.
So
Mike's our editor.
So until next time, I've been your host, Mike Josick.
And I've been your other host, Dustin Breezeman.
We'll see you on the next episode of For Your Consideration.
Peace.
Oh, all right, Lassie is done.
Aye, I can put the wee one to bed.